Hello. Hello, you lovely people, / horrifying agents of geophysical change. Hi. Thank you for having me again. It's so nice to be here. It feels like I'm home again. And yeah, this talk is called Subscendence, and that's spelt, because I don't have a PowerPoint, Subscendence, I think. So, sorry. The elixir of life. So, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's a commonplace. We say it so often that we just assume it must be true. We take it totally for granted. We all know that, don't we? But if that's true, if the whole really is greater than the sum of its parts, it doesn't really matter if those parts get replaced. We will still have our lovable old whole intact. Say the whole is the biosphere, and say the part, which we very much imagine as a component because of the holism, is a polar bear. Well, screw the polar bears. They will go extinct, and another life form will simply have to evolve to take their place. This kind of thought might not be so good for ecological ethics and politics. So for that reason alone, we might want to change our mind that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But it also turns out that, ethical and political issues aside, there are really good ontological reasons for thinking that the whole isn't greater than the sum of its parts. In particular, if you're an adherent of OOO, of object-oriented ontology, I'm one of these responsible people for that idea, you think that an entity contains a potentially infinite regress of other entities. The entity is literally outscaled by its parts. It is bigger on the inside, like Doctor Who's TARDIS, which means, logically, that it's smaller on the outside, so that however absurd and amazing it sounds, we need to say the whole is always smaller than the sum of its parts. Astonishing. Yet it helps to explain all kinds of contemporary phenomena, such as megacities. Megacities, like Houston, are really hard to find if you keep looking for a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. That is to say, and thank you, Mark, for mentioning megacities earlier. I really enjoyed Mark's talk, actually, and in particular the bit where there was the sort of humanoid, ape-like being that reminded me of myself, you know, and then all of a sudden there was a picture of a cat with sort of saucers in its eyes, and I was sort of assuming that was a slide about, you know, and then 10,000 years ago, the aliens showed up. Megacities like Houston are really hard to find if you keep looking for a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. That is to say, a whole that transcends the sum of its parts. If, on the other hand, you stop looking in the wrong place and start seeing how how the parts of Houston are much bigger ontologically than Houston itself, you start to find it. This is true on all kinds of civic and political levels too. Things can be physically massive, but ontologically small. I've given the name subscendence to this phenomenon. Thank God the title actually means something, right? Of being smaller than the sum of your parts. It turns out, and this is something I found out after I'd invented the term, thank you, Uri, that it's used in Christian theology, and it's used precisely in the way I mean. Christ subscends God, the Father, by becoming physical and small. And this is the disturbing, wonderful paradox of Christianity remarked on in the Gnostic Gospels, where Jesus declares that he became very small to save us humans. Subscendence is a very, very useful concept for thinking about hyperobjects, which are these things that I think, you know, like global warming is one. Really, really big things that you can think them and you can compute them, but you can't really see or touch them. Like you can see and touch weather, but you can't really see or touch climate. Hyperobjects subscend their parts. That's why you can't find them. Global warming and the biosphere are physically absolutely colossal, but ontologically they're small, which means that they are fragile since they can be overwhelmed by their very components. Even black holes evaporate after emitting too much Hawking radiation, and nothing at all other than themselves can destroy them. Married couples in the States are taxed as 1.5 people. Ontologically, a married couple is smaller than two unmarried people. Married couples are famously fragile. Ultimately, this means, thank you for laughing. It's awesome. Awesome laughing, thank you. Ultimately, this means that what things are is subscended by how they appear, which is how appearance comes to be death. Long story. But basically, even a hypothetical lonesome object, all on its very own, like a black hole, will end precisely because its appearance subscends its essence. There is an intrinsic excess in the being of a thing whereby it's never exhausted by its appearances. Isn't that the definition of dying? I become memories in you, pieces of crumpled paper in a wastebasket, a corpse, some loose change. These appearances subscend me, and I'm distributed into a weird, intangible intimacy. Appearance never expresses the whole, or let alone anything greater than the whole. Hyperobjects disappear downwards, not upwards, into something paradoxically more physical and thus more fragile than the beings that comprise them. This explains, for instance, the viscosity of hyperobjects, the fact that they stick to you phenomenologically wherever you are. Their hyperphysicality is what makes them so sticky. It's what makes them closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, the mercury in my cells, the radiation streaming through my DNA. They don't transcend you, they subscend you. In that respect, and perhaps like Jesus, the subscendence we discover in hyperobjects suggests we might already have passed across a limit confining thought, even atheist thought, to axial age religious dogma. Alias the Neolithic consensus in which we find ourselves, we Mesopotamians. An end to the idea of huge, overarching, tyrannical beings that are bigger than us tiny, insignificant flies they use for their sport. The fragility of, I'm saying we're Mesopotamians because we started this agriculture thing, not just there, right, but as Mark is pointing out, right, and agriculture has a certain logistics to it, which results in industry, which results in global warming, right, so like the joke kind of geological time sentence that isn't very funny yet is that in order to avoid global warming, we created much worse global warming. 10,000 years in one sentence, yeah. The fragility of hyperobjects is political good news. For example, we've been telling ourselves that neoliberalism is this ironclad Cthulhu. Cynical reason loves this kind of doom speak. But ontologically, neoliberalism is quite small compared with the polar bear. As distressing as it is for the cool kids, there is hope. So from an energy politics point of view, as Doug's pointing out, it's actually quite easy, right, to subsend the oil grid, right? You just turn the tap off there and you become this little German town that creates its own energy. It's actually not that difficult, yeah? But we keep telling ourselves it's impossible. As distressing as it is for the cool kids, there is hope. Maybe this kind of thinking is what finally distinguishes an anarchist from a Marxist, or at any rate, a certain kind of successful academic Marxist. To this extent, you can shoot me in a minute. To this extent, that kind of ideology theorist is really just a believer in Ra, someone mindlessly retweeting an agri-logistical meme that has wildly successfully transformed Earth into a narrow temporality diameter extinction pipe. Now, as I'm at this festival with Alan Wiseman, or rather without him, as it were, it gives me a fantastic opportunity to frame what I'm going to say. When we talk about the world without us, we need to realize that unless we are totally anthropocentric in our outlook, the world without us is already here. It's already a world without us. Isn't this the real fascination with that concept? That the concept hints at the possibility that things go beyond how we access them, whether we imagine that access to be taking place in thought, word, or deed. That, as object-oriented ontology likes to say, things withdraw. So, instead of the holism we are used to, in which wholes are greater than the sums of their parts, I'm advocating an implosive holism in which hyperobjects are less than the sum of their parts. The biosphere as a whole is fragile because it's less ontologically than polar bears. Marriage is less than being two people, and so on. If you think about it, subscendence affects things like nation-states, as huge and powerful as they appear. Subscendence is why you need a passport. In a way, it's not to guarantee your identity, but to guarantee and prop up the identity of the state. Yet we habitually retweet an idea that wholes are always bigger, which I think has its basis in axial age religions. Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity. Islamophobia sees Muslim terrorists as inevitably part of some larger, shadowy organization, while in the USA, white terrorists are always described as lone wolves. It's kind of absurd. No matter how many of these guys shoot people in churches and outside abortion clinics and blow up government buildings, having trained in the Christian equivalent of an Al-Qaeda training camp, just watch the video Terror from Within on Timothy McVeigh, it's on YouTube. No matter how many wolves there are, they are always seen as lone wolves, not as members of a pack. We find it almost impossible to say that 1 or 2 or even 3 white terrorists are part of some whole. We're looking for wholes to be huge and overarching. And since we can't find that kind of whole when we look at white right-wingers, we assert that they are lone wolves. Thus the concept that wholes are greater than the sum of their parts comes in ideologically handy, if you're a bit of a racist. The kinds of wholes that I'm thinking about are fuzzy and ragged. They are explosive in the way that they might involve an uncountable number of parts, but the effect of this is to cause the whole to be weirdly shrunken. I have a really good example, I think, in Raviv Gantrao's long-wave synthesis, which is going to happen, we hope, we pray, at this festival. I'm thinking more and more that adding an ecological context to interpretation is what was left out by the New Left consensus of the later 60s, the one that meant the rise of literary theory and the importance we instill in our students in finding out about how texts engage with race and gender, even when they don't explicitly engage with race and gender. Now, the thing about ecological awareness, about ecological contexts, is that you can't really draw a line around them in advance. We are dealing with a potential infinity of entities on a potential infinity of scales. There is no way to ascertain whether the pleroma of beings has an endpoint, at least not in advance. Ecological awareness is just this context explosion. Raviv Gantrao's work on infrasound is a very, very powerful case in point. It has the merit of sounding just like an explosion. Context explosion in everything sharp major, something like that should be on the title, or maybe the subtitle, the actual title, is long-wave synthesis. So here's how it works. Very large entities such as mountains and oceans sometimes move in such a way that the vibrations create sound, far too deep for humans to hear. These waves of sound travel across Earth, sweeping up all kinds of entities in their waveforms. You can record and broadcast infrasound, but you have to build a special very long speaker to push the wave through efficiently, and you have to speed it up about 80 times so that humans can hear it. An incredibly deep, loud roar, the likes of which you have never heard. Well, you sort of have. It's like the soft roar that is part of the signature of an explosion, not the shattering sounds, but the pervasive rumble. Infrasound is like chocolate pudding. A small teaspoonful of it has as much information as a huge bowl of it, because the wave is so huge. Because the wave is so large, it's likely that the information it contains is distributed evenly throughout the structure. To that extent, it's weirdly like a hologram, in which parts of the interference pattern contain the whole object imaged by the process. A small piece of a hologram of a rose will display the rose when you shine light on it. There is probably more than a superficial analogy here, because infrasound probably does take the form of an interference pattern, like a hologram. Why? Because the infrasonic wavefront picks up everything else. The wave traveling across the ocean scoops up the shape of the mountains over which it pours, the buildings around which it rushes, airplanes, earthquakes, bomb tests. It's a beautiful, powerful illustration of a very basic but very deep Heideggerian observation that you never hear the wind as such. You only hear the wind in the doorway, the wind in the trees. Objects are withdrawn, so you only ever access, and everything else only ever accesses, translations of them. Now imagine all the largest objects on Earth translating one another simultaneously. The sound that made, that would be the limit of infrasound. Now I think you're ready for the full title of Gantrao's work. Long-wave synthesis. I'm sort of proud that we came up with this on a plane to Oslo. And it took pretty much the whole flight to put this list together. Long-wave synthesis for pneumatic compressor, 10-bar pneumatic hose, pneumatic transducer, birch plywood compression, motor vehicle pistons, auroral air displacement, barometric pressure, Barents Sea offshore rig gas flares, wolf howls, relative humidity, Lord Rayleigh, pressure waves, travelling waves, Atlantic Ocean standing waves, microbaroms, wind speed, wind shear, wind orientation, kinesthetic orientation, air mass, skin pressure, meteorograph, stomach resonance, ear canal depth, woolen hat transmission, frost, fungus, rusted metal, concrete walls, mobile listeners, weather suits, shrubbery absorption, discarded wooden panelling, assorted gravel, distance between air molecules, mountain range turbulence, pond oscillations, I'm toasting, moss, rock surface texture, thickness of atmosphere, Earth circumference, 15-inch transducer, jet stream shear, stratosphere circulations, troposphere temperature inversion, Earth rotation, drag, space debris, re-entry, asphalt friction, reindeer hoof impacts, soil conduction, shooter-hill transmission, shockwave reverberation, impact engineering, oil core mining, carving, Arctic glaciers, TNT, World War I, gun sound ranging, Icelandic volcanoes, chemical explosions, nuclear proliferation, CT-BT nuclear test ban, monitoring, long-range communication, XLR signal cables, speaker cables, 240-volt power cable, 24-volt signal multiplication circuit, 400-watt amplifier, power phase inverter, 1200-watt power supply, 4.5 kilowatt diesel generator, thunder, jet engines, meteor explosions, supersonic flight, Krakatoa, Kirkenes Airport, Luftwaffe's Arctic Front, impeller acoustics, 440 RPM rotor transducer, 2.4 gigahertz laptop computer, 5,000-year-old Brummers, Scandinavian bull roarer, 500-second waveforms, 4 AM snow crystals, 24-hour recording from Bardufoss's IS-37 array, September the 12th, 2014. And I thought that was an idea worth sharing. Infrasound is a Tolstoy novel about mountains, oceans, and deserts. It's a perfect example of art in what I take to be the age of asymmetry, an ecological age in which we have so much more scientific data about things, which makes the things appear so much huger and more mysterious, so that increasing knowledge doesn't master objects. There is instead a Cold War-like explosion of knowledge and mysterious withdrawnness at the same time and for the same reasons. Unlike in Hegel's picture of art history, in which knowledge gradually outstrips art materials, resulting in irony and the artist's successful failures to embody spirit from the late 18th century on. That picture is, in retrospect, just a symptom of the hubris that marks the beginning of the Anthropocene, which we have been calling modernity. But the impetus to transcend one's material conditions in every respect has resulted in drilling down, literally, ever deeper into them, to the extent that now we have realized that this very movement has created far larger and more immersive material conditions than ever before. Global warming lasts for 100,000 years. This age of asymmetry turns out not even to be neatly asymmetrical, if you see what I mean. It's not really about humans full of inner space versus non-humans also full of inner space, because it's at this very moment that humans discover that they are one of those objects, precisely insofar as we are now allowing them all to be TARDISes like us, to contain multitudes. What is the phenomenological style of thinking or feeling subscendence? It is susceptibility. Subscendence guarantees that objects encounter us like some kind of flu, getting inside our own fuzzy, ragged boundaries and unfolding their operations from a place closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Subscendence means, therefore, that we humans really aren't nihilistic princes of darkness, as Graham Harman puts it, but chameleon-like entities that are susceptible to colors, surfaces, sound waves, the way the flesh at the back of my eye is palpated by electromagnetic waves spraying out of an excited yttrium oxide coating on the inside of an LCD display or cathode ray tube. I see red because yttrium waves are touching me, because I'm not a rigidly bounded whole, but a ragged, subscendent one. I can wave along with this redness for a moment. And susceptibility is obviously very good news for ecological ethics and politics. I can be touched. Indeed, thinking itself on this view is a kind of touching and being touched, by which I mean precisely not a guarantee of full metaphysical presence, but a disorienting flicker that haunts me, or pleasures me, or hurts me, or and so on. Any visual artist knows that visuality is badly misrepresented by philosophies that use the language of sight to establish constantly present things to be seen, and the too easy linkage of seeing and knowing. Perhaps ecological philosophy needs to generate a whole new language that inclines more towards touch, towards the haptic. This is really because seeing is subscended by touching. It's not that seeing is reducible to touching, as if touching were more constantly present and the equivalent of doubting Thomas thrusting his hand into the wound and feeling it for himself. It's that seeing, like hearing, is a part of touching, a whole that is not greater than the sum of its parts. The touch is lowly, susceptible, risky, humble. It subscends being able to see around and above and beyond a thing. It subscends because it is nearer, more intimate, quite the opposite of more encompassing and less intimate. One more thing, maybe. Subscendence is a close cousin of transcendence. It has to do with gaps between things and how they appear, whereas immanence, which is a very popular way of talking in an ecological way, eliminates these gaps. But if there is no difference between a polar bear and a polar bear appearance, then when the polar bear goes extinct, there is no problem. In fact, extinction doesn't really happen. Whereas, in a world of subscendence, extinction happens and I can think it, but I can't know it, or see it, or touch it. Evolution, biosphere, global warming, all these are the same. They happen and I can think or compute them, and yet I can't directly see them. Evolution and the biosphere are telling us something about polar bears. They are also subject to subscendence. They are subscended by their appearances. A symbiotic community, and we are all symbiotic communities, is a perfect example of a subscendent whole. I am less than an individual qua human with "this is a human being" engraved throughout every single piece of me. I am a human insofar as I have bacteria and prostheses such as cattle and fossil fuels. The Anthropocene is the moment at which we actually come to know that. But it's so much weirder than realizing that I'm immanent to humans as a whole bigger than me. In fact, it's almost the opposite. When I start my car, I don't mean to harm Earth, and I'm not. It's statistically meaningless, but when billions of people start their cars, this is exactly what happens. There is a gap between me and the species of which I am a member. And furthermore, I can't locate this gap anywhere in phenomenal, ontic, given, observable space. I can't point to it. And it does so much less than I do. It does just one thing really, really well right now. It destroys Earth. The point would be to see whether this being can stop its zombie-like behavior, because right now we are fingernails of a zombie. One of the things disrupting our human world is the human. The Anthropocene is the first truly anti-anthropocentric concept, because via thinking the Anthropocene, we can get to see species as it really is. Species as a subscendent hyperobject, brittle and inconsistent. Thank you very much.